Well, when we talk about morality, we talk about some ability to tell good versus evil.
I think probably their parents. I certainly did. I wasn't part of a regular church-going family. We went to church a little bit in a certain period, I remember, but morals in my family were just about being kind.
I think you get your morals from your parents, mostly.
Yeah, I guess they are passed down from your parents.
It's quite a complicated question because I think your morals are informed by, your parents, your religious structures, your community structures, your personal experiences, your mistakes, the things that are done to you, the things that you could have done better.
I'm a firm believer that we are born as humans with a clean slate morally. Like, morals are definitely encompassed by your upbringing and what's kind of hammered into your brain. But I think that as humans, morally, our moral compass, we are born with it pointing upward.
I believe that morals come from within and how you're brought up. So it depends on the person.
Scripturally, we're told that everyone has sort of like, we have our conscience.
Probably your morals shape as you get older and you have experiences and the different people who have effect on your life.
I'm sure it affects me more than I actually realize how much it affects me. But I think going to church probably shaped a lot of who I am and my morals.
And any sort of hate or racism or prejudice of any form is it comes from conditioning.
So it's kind of like when I think something is good, it might not be what you think is good. For example, child marriage, right? In some cultures, it's okay, but not in some other countries and cultures.
Irish Italian Catholic has a certain set of stereotypes around it that doesn't actually apply to me because the religious and spiritual portion of my formative years was actually quite gentle and rewarding. Where things got difficult, so I grew up in a household that was full of very, very severe domestic violence.
I think that when a person is born into the world, I think that they have kind of set morals, like within themselves, and I think that God kind of helps enhance the good morals.
The question about whether we can have morality without God is that we cannot.
That is pretty much, I guess, what God is being used for most of the time. Is to be the figure of morality.
Yes, I am a Christian. I do believe that there's a God, but I also realize that we are in a new time. We're not, here during the Bible time.
My grandma's a very, very Catholic woman, and she will fully admit that she was always told that gay is wrong, and she's never actually taken the time to think about what that means or why she thinks that. It's just something that was put into her head by people that she trusts, and she still trusts them, absolutely. But it wasn't until I came out to her, which I actually didn't do, I got my mom to tell her, that she kind of came to the conclusion that she was like, why do I actually think this? Because a book is telling me to think this?
See the people in church who are, uber Christian, and they do all the right Christian things, and they only have Christian friends, and they only do Christian events.
So whether you say that there's a scientific explanation through like evolutionary, however molecules come together that make us who we are, or if you say that there's a spiritual.
I feel like if you live life purely scientifically, I don't know how your moral compass would work properly, I guess. I feel like there has to be more pushing it than just being like right is right, wrong is wrong.
Luke Fevin, atheist right activist and director of Edmonton Atheist and A Pupil, will debate Jojo Ruba, Christian executive director of Faith Beyond Belief, in a debate titled, Can You Have Morality Without God? That's right. Thank you very much for that video. Welcome to a very special Agree or Disagree the podcast. My name is Kevin Olenek, and thank you very much for joining us. I have been privileged enough to do interviews, roundtables, discussions, all kinds of different things since I started this podcast back in February of 2014. Generally, mostly just in an online or recorded podcast format. Tonight, we're doing something a little bit different. We are actually doing my first ever, myself, moderating a live online debate. And our debate tonight, as you heard from the video, is objective. Can we have an objective morality without God? We were hoping to have this in video format. Unfortunately, it is only in audio format, but we will upload this to YouTube that you can listen to and later and share with your friends. Thank you also. I'm sitting here in the Vancouver Public Library, rainy, really rainy Vancouver. I need a boat to go home. I'm using their studio to moderate the debate, so thank you very much for the Vancouver Public Library for providing the space for free. Just a couple of quick ground rules before we get started. Luke and Jojo have both taken the time to help me. This is my final project. I'm a broadcasting student, for those who don't know, at the Vancouver Institute of Media Arts, finishing my one-year program, and I selected to do a debate as my final project. So, would really appreciate that you give both of our guests respect today, no matter what perspective that you stand on. Not only are you showing respect to them, you're showing respect to me as well. So, I do appreciate that. I do hope that you expect that there will be things that you do agree or disagree with, but respect, please. We'll talk about the online questions in a little moment here, but first let's meet our guest. Jojo Ruba equips Christians to be effective ambassadors for Christ for everyday conversations. He has spoken at venues that include Sunday morning services, secular debates on universities, and morning chapels at Christian schools. Jojo focuses on practical ways to defend the faith. He teaches Christians how to explain their worldview using tools that non-Christians can understand. Jojo, thanks for being here with us today.
Glad to be here, Kevin, and glad not to be in rainy Vancouver.
Yeah, but I heard it's snowing in Calgary.
No, actually, it's plus 11 here.
Oh, burn. God is angry.
It's all right. It's going to be plus 14 tomorrow.
Oh, rub it in. We're having a little bit, also interestingly enough, kind of a battle of Alberta. Luke Fevin is a dad to 3 awesome kids, husband to a long-suffering wife of almost 20 years, and has had the privilege of living and working on 3 continents, finally settling in absolutely one of the best places to raise a family in the world, Alberta, specifically St. Albert. He sits on the board of the Society of Edmonton Atheists, is a co-founder of A Pupil, a secular rights group, and can be seen or heard frequently on a number of radio, TV, and podcasts. Luke is a passionate advocate of public education and can be found through his According to Luke handle on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. That's According, the number 2, Luke. Luke, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be with you. Appreciate the invitation. And yes, I'm looking forward to plus 14 tomorrow, too.
Yes, I feel like you've both taken the time to rub it in. All I have to say is ocean, but I can't even see it right now, so that doesn't help me at all. So we're using a traditional debate format for tonight. So opening statements will first start with Luke, and then we'll follow with Jojo, cross-examinations, Luke and Jojo. The opening statements will be 18 minutes, cross-examination will be 6 minutes. Rebuttals will be held to 10 minutes, and then both will have 9 minutes for closing statements each. We'll have a approximately 20-minute answer from the question and answer from the audience. I posted on my Facebook page, which I put public, and on the group event page where you can ask questions, and we'll go through them as near the end. You can also tweet at KEVOLE as well if you have questions on Twitter as well. But we will start with Luke will take the floor here, and he will have 18 minutes. At 3 minutes from now, I will just give you a little reminder. You have 3 minutes left, Luke, okay?
Sounds good.
All right. Go ahead.
Okay. Well, let's start with the thank yous. Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate the invitation to participate in this. And thank you to Jojo. He's the one person here that actually brings some experience and expertise to the conversation. So thanks for that. Also, thank you to anyone listening live and listening to the recorded version of this. It's appreciated. Regardless of whatever perspective you enter this discussion from, it's of paramount importance that we be able to have it at all. And that is something I'm grateful for. Whether it's at a state level or at a societal level, it is critical that ideas and concepts be allowed to air, and for them to be freely examined, tested, and where necessary, criticized. The question before us today is, can we have objective morality without God? The answer is no. Not because of anything to do with God, but because that there is no objective morality. And that is my subjective opinion. But even if one argued that there is objective morality, which I think someone could take a pretty good run at, it would still not require a God. In fact, if there is objective morality, the Abrahamic God is by definition immoral. It was an interesting experience preparing for this debate, partly because I've never done one before, which always makes things a little intimidating. And whenever I have spoken publicly before, it's been on matters far more easily defined in terms of laws and constitutions and facts and so on. Philosophy, nor logic as a discipline, is my wheelhouse. And that may show up from time to time today, but that's okay. I wanted to take on this discussion for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think we need to take the woo-woo out of some of these debates, and I think we need to bring these conversations and concepts back to the realm of the regular person. And secondly, I think we need to recognize something else about this debate. Really, it's just another way religious folk like to try and backdoor God into existence. It is usually religious people with a religious agenda, often well-funded by churches, driving these conversations and debates. Can't demonstrate that God exists by actually demonstrating that he exists. Can't demonstrate an afterlife. Can't demonstrate he answers prayers, although they ignore the countless studies that demonstrate he doesn't. So here we are embarking on what is likely to be another mind-bending, logic-twisting, definition-stretching conversation to try and convince people that God exists. Typically, of course, we see 5 key arguments in this vein. The cosmological argument from contingency, the Kalam cosmological argument of everything that has a beginning, the teleological argument from fine-tuning, although let's also note that there is nothing more finely tuned than a God that exists absolutely the most it can without actually being detectable in any way at all, a line that moves coincidentally with the reach and knowledge of science and apparently is inversely proportional to the number of camera phones in the world. There's the ontological argument of possible worlds and the moral argument based upon moral values and duties, which is, I'm guessing, the version that we're going to be going through today. But before diving into that discussion, let's make sure we're on the same page about what we're talking about. Can we have objective morality without God? So let's define those 3 words. Objective morality and God. In the interest of fairness, I just pulled them straight from Merriam-Webster. So objective, based on facts rather than feelings or opinions. And in the realm of philosophy, existing outside of the mind, existing in the real world. Morality, beliefs about what is right behavior and what is wrong behavior, the degree to which something is right and good, or the moral goodness or badness of something. And God. And this is Merriam-Webster, this is not my definition. The perfect and all-powerful spirit or being that is worshipped especially by Christians, Jews, and Muslims as the one who created and rules the universe. A spirit or being that has great power, strength, knowledge, etc., and can affect nature and the lives of people. And then, because I think it might come up, subjective, in philosophy, relating to the way a person experiences things in his or her mind, based on feelings or opinions rather than facts. So, objective morality is the idea that a certain system of ethics or a set of moral judgments is not just true according to a person's subjective opinion, but is factually true in a universal sense. So I'm all good with objective, subjective, and morality, but let's be clear on the God thing here. God has a capital G in this case, and there is a big difference between, is there some kind of being, conscious or unconscious, physically or dimensionally bigger than us, and Yahweh, who made everything and intervenes in our lives, acting as some kind of gatekeeper to an afterlife with rules, expectations, rewards, and punishments. I mean, we could have objective morality without God. Let's say the universe is a virtual simulation, and Trevor and Barry, running the gig, decide to make the color purple sacrosanct. So any damage or harm to anything purple would automatically become objectively morally wrong. So there you go. Can we have objective morality without God? We just did. I'm even open to being able to drive the concept of the well-being of conscious creatures as a basis for objective morality to a conclusion. But even this is a position that requires empathy rather than a God. The God, as generally described in these discussions, is incapable of being or establishing objective morality anyway. If he is timeless, without cause, beginning and end, he is essentially random and meaningless. And if he's random and meaningless, he has no ability for claiming objectiveness. He would be as subjective as the rest of us. Besides, if we look at examples of what could be objective moralities, let's say the suffering of conscious creatures, then God fails there too. I think the suffering of conscious creatures is as close as one can get to defining a basis for an objective morality. But the natural world, with all its physical disasters, and note, they're only disasters to us. They're not disasters in any objective sense. They're just events, cause suffering to millions and millions of conscious creatures. Billions of conscious creatures lived and died, often in fear, pain, and suffering, long before humans came along. The food chain, even today, causes millions of conscious creatures to be constantly experiencing fear, pain, and suffering. Even the human consciousness, under relatively good conditions, still seems to be fraught with emotional suffering. And the planet we are on is about halfway through a life cycle that ends with the expansion of the sun and the heat death of every living thing on this planet. And it will probably be a Monday. So if the suffering of conscious creatures is bad, then causing it would be, by definition, immoral. By extension, standing by and doing nothing when one holds the power to end suffering would also be immoral. In fact, let's just be clear for a moment, it would be bloody evil. If a human stood by and watched a child suffering in a completely preventable way and did nothing, we would say that person was beyond sick. If someone stood by and watched a dog suffering but did nothing, then we would say that person was the very definition of immoral. To try and ascribe an objective morality to an all-powerful God that either set up the suffering or stands by and watching it while choosing to do nothing does not stand. When multiple objective morals collide, everything becomes subjective. And in one glorious logical paradox, God renders himself either immoral or irrelevant. Can you have an objective morality without God? No, there is no objective morality. But even if one grants that objective reality does exist, it doesn't just follow that God exists. And I provided an irrefutable example already. But it does logically follow that if he does exist, then he himself is both subjective and immoral. If God himself is timeless and causeless, then his existence is essentially random and meaningless, and something random and meaningless cannot be objective. And if we are to say that perhaps the suffering of conscious creatures is objectively bad, then God failed in his objectivity for subjectively choosing to allow the suffering to persist. Further, I would argue that the concept of a God-driven objective morality is in itself immoral, and it's contributed massively to human suffering over the ages. What kind of foolishness drives men in positions of religious power to go into Africa and tell people that condoms are objectively immoral, contributing to the spread of HIV? What kind of ill-guided idiocy tells women in poverty not to use contraception from a place of objective morality, by perpetuating the cycle of poverty and suffering? And what kind of sick, twisted asshattery teaches that our fellow man is objectively disordered, significantly contributing to the pain and suffering of millions of gay and LGBTQ humans and their friends and their families? I put it to you that not only does objective morality not exist, but that pushing a God-centric objective reality actually causes suffering, and as such is subjectively immoral. Or, in a final and beautiful ironic twist, by its own judgment, religion-based objective morality would be subjectively immoral. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Luke. Now, I should mention before we go on here to Jojo's response, I do understand I am recording live right now and people are not able to join. We are trying to fix that as we speak. I am actually speaking to Spreaker as we do this, so hopefully we can get this going as soon as possible. If not, as I mentioned, for those that are listening, we will have this up immediately after. And we can get this going here. Just give me a quick moment here. Okay. Yeah, I'm doing what I can to get this fixed. I do apologize. I am showing that this is recording live. There might have been something on my end that I did not do. So it will be up right after it is done. It's going to be up and shared on social media immediately. I do apologize for anyone that is missing that at this point. My profuse apologies that there's technology, I tell you, sometimes. But Jojo, are you ready to go, or are you here?
Well, as much as I can. Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry, I'm a little distracted because all my friends are saying that they can't hear. So
okay, I will.
I would need. Luke, you might have to explain some of those concepts again during cross-examination. So please be patient with me. All right. So I'm going to start with my start button, if that's okay, so we can have the 18 minutes, Kevin.
Yeah,
so
that's
can we
fine.
synchronize that?
Yeah, absolutely.
And go.
Go ahead.
Well, I'd like to thank Kevin for organizing this debate and for Luke for participating. It's always good to have civil discussion, and I mean that as an objective good, of course, not a subjective good. I'm also very glad to be able to have all of you who are able to listen, and hopefully for those who are able to listen afterwards, to be able to participate as well. You know, these kinds of discussions are often seen as obscure ones, but they're really fundamental in terms of how we engage in society and who we are as Canadians particularly. So I'm really glad that you spent the time to talk to us today and listen in. Today I want to defend two positions based on the statement that we're discussing. First, that objective morality does exist. There is something there that we cannot escape. Even Luke's own actions and organizations prove this. Secondly, that you cannot have objective morals without God. That there has to be some sort of higher power that's supernatural, that's able to give us these objective moral rules that we live by. And I'm glad to agree with most of what Luke said in terms of definition, in terms of morality. I have Webster's here. Morality, I'm going to be starting off with definitions. Morality is principles concerning the distinction between right and wrong or good and bad behavior. A particular system of values and principles of conduct. Now, I also found a description of objective morality from Rational Wiki, which Luke knows is the Wikipedia for atheists and agnostics and free thinkers. It says objective morality is the idea that a certain system of ethics or set of moral judgments is not just true according to a person's subjective opinion, but factually true. Proponents of this theory would argue that a statement like murder is wrong can be as objectively true as 1 + 1 = 2. Now, when we think about objective morality, of course, it's clear that objective moral principles often have distinctions. People disagree. But I think in terms of even basic truths, like it's wrong to murder people, the objective moral principles still apply regardless of what we debate or we talk about. So, for example, killing an innocent person would be objectively wrong. But if a person were about to kill my child and I defend her, that would be different from killing an innocent person. And so the action actions might be different in terms of how I defend myself or how we apply the principle, but the principle tends to be the same. Now, the reason why I bring that up is because when it comes to these basic rules of how ought we to behave, I think all of us in society, all cultures around the world, have these kinds of moral standards. There are ways for us to be able to look at how we ought to behave. Terry Lewis of crossexamine.org, which is a Christian website, says, look, when we talk about moral values, really let's think about two competing ideas of what morals could look like. If we had a moral universe, what would that look like? And if we had an amoral, which means a universe without any moral truths or any objective morals, which is what Luke is defending, then what would that look like? So he says a moral universe is one which has objective moral categories that include values, which is what is good and evil, and duties, which include right and wrong actions, exist. An amoral universe only has subjective moral categories. That means these things are only true for you, true for the person, true in that subject's opinion or preference or feeling. Now, this is really important because if we look at our universe, he says, let's take a look at the reality that we live in and ask which one matches our reality better, a moral universe or an amoral universe. In a moral universe, Terry Lewis says that there are three kinds of actions. There will be moral actions, immoral actions, and amoral actions. Moral actions, of course, are those that conform to an objective moral standard. An immoral action is one that doesn't conform, and an amoral standard is one that is not addressed by moral standards at all. When we ask about these objective moral standards, there's two quick questions we would ask about that. First, are there rules that apply to everybody? Things like racism, things like rape, things like you shouldn't force your religion on people. Are these rules that apply to everyone in every time period, in every culture? Now, I'm not asking if these are practiced by every person or every time period, and we're not even asking if everyone agrees with these standards, but that there are these kinds of objective standards that people ought to behave by and ought to do. Secondly, are these moral rules prescriptive or descriptive? Are these moral rules prescriptive or descriptive? And obviously a prescription is something that says that we ought to act a certain way. A description is merely a description of what is happening. And I would argue that, of course, when it comes to morality, we're talking about what ought to happen, not just something that is happening. And when we think about these kinds of understandings, then it's obvious that an amoral universe doesn't have any of these things at all. There would be no moral difference between someone feeding their child and someone killing their child. These are just things that we simply prefer or simply do not like, or in our opinion, in this culture at this time, we would disagree with. Now, when it comes to this kind of amoral standard, the question is, what then does our universe look like? Does it look like a universe with moral standards that apply to everybody, that there are prescriptions of how we ought to behave? Or is it an amoral universe where there are no objective moral standards at all? Everything is mere opinion. Well, the problem with an amoral universe is twofold, I think. There's others we can explore later on. First, the idea of an amoral universe is existentially self-refuting. What does that mean? That means if you live in this amoral universe and then you require other people to act a certain kind of way, then you're actually contradicting the idea that there are no objective moral standards. You can't expect people to behave simply because of your preference. It's just like saying everybody ought to like purple. A great example, Luke, by the way. That doesn't make any sense. That's just a preference, a personal taste. But if you're going to say something like, blasphemy laws in Muslim countries are terrible and they ought to change, then you're requiring an objective moral standard to be able to say that to a Muslim country that has a different culture and different worldview than you. Because at that point, morality doesn't come from culture or worldview, it comes from something above it. And that's exactly what Luke's organization actually does. It speaks against blasphemy laws. Now, don't get me wrong, I think he's right on that, objectively. But he cannot be objectively right on that in an amoral universe. In fact, Joel Marx, who's a philosopher, says, when I experienced my shocking epiphany that religious fundamentalists are correct. Without God, there is no morality. But they are incorrect. I still believe about there being no God, hence I believe there is no morality. In sum, while theists take the obvious existence of moral commands to be a kind of proof of the existence of a commander, I now take the non-existence of commander as a kind of proof that there are no commands, which is what Luke's trying to argue here. The problem is, if that's the case, the only impetus that someone else should have to listen to what Luke is saying and what Professor Marx is saying is their personal preference. And in fact, Professor Marx says this: if I were conversing with another amoralist, how would I convince her of the rightness of my desires? Well, of course, I wouldn't even try, since neither of us believe in right and wrong. What I could do is take her through the same considerations that have moved me to take my position and hope that her heartstrings were tuned in harmony with mine. If the two of us have grown up in the same culture, we'll certainly have many desires in common, which is great if you're talking about desires, but what about things like it's wrong to kill atheists just because they're atheists in Muslim countries? That's something that people in those countries wouldn't agree with, but is what they're doing objectively wrong? If it is, then we cannot live in an amoral universe. Secondly, the idea of moral categories would be unintelligible in an amoral universe. We're debating tonight about whether moral objective morality exists. But the question is, how do preferences become any kind of moral standard that everyone ought to follow in the first place? Remember, Luke actually said that morals in this case, in an amoral universe, are merely subjective. And subjective morality or subjective means, and according to the dictionary, characteristic of or being to reality as perceived rather than as an independent mind, in lacking in reality or substance. Now, when we think about it this way, then it's clear that there's no impetus for anyone to listen to arguments from an amoral universe. It's simply, as Joel Marx says, a matter of convincing someone that their preference is the same as ours. But the problem is, if everything is merely a subjective preference, then how can we convince people that they ought to agree with us? Because obviously not everybody has the same preferences. In fact, in 2011, Mr. Luke actually talks about a situation that happened in religion, concerning religion and public schools. And he said this in an article on his website. In the 21st century, it is understood that the only way to accord every child the equality, respect, and opportunity that they each deserve without discrimination, exclusion, or humiliation is with a secular public school system. This is not anti-religion, it is freedom of religion. But again, if there is no objective morality, what do these words actually mean? Things like discrimination, exclusion, humiliation are not objectively wrong, they're only wrong for Luke. Worse, this is what he says: for Alberta taxpayers and for Alberta's children to get an education that treats and considers all equally, again, equally doesn't mean anything, or without discrimination or exclusion, to get a system that operates efficiently with no hidden agendas for each community to get the schools it deserves, for us to reduce the costs, risk, traffic, and travel time associated with many of our children, and finally for us to save and reinvest far more than $100 million plus that we are currently borrowing from our savings funds to merely limit the cuts. That is going to require both the politicians and the religious to do not what is self-serving, but what is right, capital R. And that just might take a miracle. So the question is, what is this capital R that he says religious groups and the government ought to do to go beyond their self-serving interests? Again, it can't be anything objective if he's right. It merely is his preference. But even in this paragraph, he's referencing an objective moral standard, what is right, capital R, that he thinks everyone, even people who disagree with him, even religious people like me, ought to accept and follow. In fact, Philip Gorski, a sociology professor at Yale, says the accordances of our minds and our languages and the demands of social cooperation and interaction will not permit us it long for us to believe that morality is subjective, is what he's saying. We cannot, he says, escape ethical life. And I agree with him. In fact, I would say there's actually only 5 real sources for morality, which is the second point I want to argue. But morals have to come from some sort of supernatural source. First, morality can come from ourselves. We can determine what's right and wrong for us. Well, again, even Luke's comment here shows that it's obviously not the case that we can have right and wrong only from ourselves. Right and wrong morality can also come from our society. But then the Constitution of Canada actually guarantees religious people like Catholics the right to have education. If society determines right and wrong, what standard does Luke and his organizations use to say that the law is wrong? If the law determines right and wrong, clearly he can't question the law at this point in Canada or in places where blasphemy is illegal. Right and wrong can come also from our biology. But again, this is problematic because if we can evolve into a moral system, how can we say that we can't evolve out of it? How do material things create immaterial oughts of how we ought to behave? Richard Dawkins even says, the total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. During the minute that it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive. Many others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear. Others are slowly being devoured from within by rasping parasites. Thousands of all kinds are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. It must be so. If there ever is a time of plenty, this very fact will automatically lead to an increase in the population until the natural state of starvation and misery is restored. In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces, and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt. Other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference. Now that's a very consistent worldview in terms of understanding there is no objective morality. So evolution or biology cannot give us any kind of moral standard. The problem is we act as if objective moral standards exist. And Luke's organization, even when he talks about how we ought not to kill people who blaspheme, is pointing to the fact that there's some moral standards that exist for everybody. Now, the other option right now that's being raised is nature, the fourth option in terms of where we get moral laws. Sam Harris and Luke alludes to this, suggests that morals come from the prospering of conscious organisms, particularly human beings. Now, and that is something that often people bring up as what is morally good, and therefore he argues that God can't be morally good because he allows suffering to happen. Now, that's a different debate about evil and suffering. I think I would argue that a good God would also mean that there's certain standards that we have to follow, and if we don't follow those standards, well, suffering happens, right? But in terms of the prospering of conscious beings, the question I would ask is which ones, which conscious beings? And I'm not just talking about animals and human beings. I'm talking about within even human beings itself. Atheist H.G. Wells actually wrote a book called The Time Machine. And in that book, he wrote about how the human race evolved into two different species. They're both human, but one race eats the other humans. So the only way for one human race to prosper is to eat the other one. So in Sam Harris's definition of conscious people not suffering, what is then moral in that situation? I even point out that in an interview that Luke did with Kevin, he calls himself an anti-theist. Not anti-theism, anti-theist. He's against people like myself who believe in God. So wait a second, if he's that way, if his position prospers, that means my tribe as theists doesn't. So based on that definition of morality, which one of us is being moral if we let one tribe prosper and the other one doesn't? In other words, there still has to be some sort of arbitrator who's beyond humanity who helps determine what right and wrong is. In fact, when we look at the definition of God, and I like his definition as well, but I would add from Webster, it says, the supreme or ultimate reality, the being perfect in power, wisdom, and goodness, who is worshipped as creator and ruler of the universe. Now, obviously, this fits more with the Christian, Jewish, and Muslim definition of God. There are other God definitions out there, but that's the one I'm going to use right now for this debate. And the reason why that is because I think it makes sense then that if there is an objective standard of how we as humans ought to behave, regardless of time and place, then the source of that law ought to be from something that's beyond our time and our place. It has to come from somewhere else. It can't be limited by time and place. More than that, it has to be coming from someone who has the right to make the law and the power to enforce the law. That's why you stop at stop signs, because it's made by someone who has the right to make the law and the power to enforce that law. If there are moral laws that exist, and I'm arguing that there have to be, in order for us to condemn genocide, in order for us to be able to say that we have a right to do what we do, then these moral standards have to come from someone who has the right to make the law and the power to enforce that law. In fact, if there are no objective moral truths, then what Luke says on his Twitter account can't even make sense. On his Twitter account, he describes himself as a secular atheist rights activist, but not trying to be a total dick about it. See, the problem is if there are moral rights, then there are no such thing as objective rights in whatever. Violating those rights won't matter. And whatever it means to be a total dick, that won't matter either. And that's why I believe that there are objective moral truths and that God is the source of them.
All right. Thank you, Jojo. So as mentioned before, I do apologize again. There might have been something on my end, that a button that I might have not have clicked, but the audio of this will be up right after. So if there's anyone listening live, bless you. For those that are trying to get in live that were not able to do that, again, I apologize. I think there might have been a button I missed on my end that probably missed the link, but this will be up right after we are done. So the next part of this is Luke, and he has some time, but I just need to figure out how much time we're on. Rebuttal,
6 minutes.
6 minutes for cross-examination. Or do we want to go rebuttal and then cross-examination?
I'm open, but I would suggest maybe cross-ex would work, but it's up to you, Luke.
I'm given the fact that this is my first time doing this, I genuinely have no idea how this works. So I'm happy to hold a sensible back and forth, and I understand that for a few minutes I'll have the lead on the back and forth, and then you'll have the lead, and we'll go from there.
Okay. So we'll do the rebuttal We'll do a 10-minute rebuttal at this point, Luke, which is just you speaking to what Jojo commented, and then after that, then Jojo will have 10 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity for you specifically to cross-examine Jojo for 6 minutes, and then Jojo will cross-examine you for 6 minutes as well.
All right.
All right. Thanks you, everyone, for your patience again.
Okay, so we're going into a cross-examination here.
No, just you want to rebut anything that Jojo said in his opening statement.
Oh, okay. And I tell you what, I'm genuinely okay, Jojo. If you use your discretion, because if I mischaracterize something, then you feel free to just say, "Hang on, I just want to clarify that." So anyway, here we go. Someone took a breath like they wanted to say something.
No, go ahead.
No? Okay, so the first thing is, let me just clarify the anti-theist thing, just so that doesn't get any legs. Anti-theist certainly doesn't refer to people. It refers to theism. You can take the position that I should have said I'm an anti-theismist, which seems a little cumbersome. I think anti-theist, referring to the concept of theistic theology and beliefs, is in play and is the norm. But perhaps if I could, slightly tongue-in-cheek and possibly slightly dickishly say, I have an issue with the delusion, not with the deluded. That was a little joke there relative to, never mind. Okay, so Jojo made so many good points that I couldn't keep up with, but he made so many points that I had issues with. So if I try and just take them down to the key ones that stand out for me. Firstly, there's this assertion that if a universe doesn't have any objective morality, then somehow it's not possible for us to have morality in it or to be moral. Then I think this universe is currently self-refuting. Until we demonstrate that there is some kind of deity, the assumption has to be that there is no deity. And so if we are living in a morally guided world right now, and there is no evidence for a deity, then apparently we seem to have got here on our own, and that would be consistent with the claim that empathy through evolution, or that empathy is a result of evolution, and that's how we've got here. If we have a if the universe does have an objective morality,
it's 7 o'clock.
It is a strange and dangerous place relative to human beings. So anyway, the first thing I would say is, I have argued before that there is a logical argument that if there is a creator being, the one could logically argue that empathy, love, compassion, a place where ultimately we get to the positive experience of conscious creatures, can be argued logically. But that does not mean that the universe has to exist in that way, with or without a deity currently. Now, the other problem that Jojo has in his explanation is that his objective morality seems to revolve around the well-being of human beings rather than all conscious creatures. And if something is objective, then it is clearly outside of human beings. If it's outside of human beings, then it's not going to favor human beings unless it is directed by some kind of creator being. And if the creator being has an opinion, then it is clearly a subjective opinion that the creator being has. I tell you what, let me, I'm going to back up and take a look at a couple more of my notes. Is there a little bit of meat there for you to chew on, Jojo?
Yeah, it's your 10 minutes, so.
Yeah, okay. Well, look, but I don't have anything that I particularly want to, try and grill you for. So I throw out those as being.
Yeah, this isn't a cross-examination. Sorry, Luke. We'll give you more time, but this isn't cross-examination. What Kevin did was flip rebuttal and cross-ex.
Yeah.
So you're not supposed to be asking me any questions right now. It's your
I
time.
think, but
yeah.
if do you,
No, I'm good. I see. The funny thing is, I think I can sum up really what my issue with Jojo's argument is in about 60 seconds. So perhaps I'll just do that. This morality that is supposed to have existed, this absolute objective morality, hasn't shown up for an awful long time in this universe. I mean, conscious human beings have only existed for somewhere between 100 and 200,000 years. We've only been messing around with gods for 10,000 years, as much as we know, and yet this universe is, as best we know, 13.8 billion years old. It is staggeringly huge. It has an almost infinite number of stars and planets in it. It is phenomenally hostile to the existence of human beings and to conscious life on Earth, and it makes absolutely no logical sense to me that a being that apparently cares specifically about human beings would set up a system in which we arrive for such a small amount of time on such a precariously dangerous rock in an environment that is absolutely brutal for human existence, and then puts us on a rock that spends a large amount of time trying to kill us with a lot of other creatures, and that we kill and kills us. I'm really struggling to comprehend how a moral being that loves us and wants to know us, it seems completely at odds. And the last thing I would say, Jojo, and perhaps you want to start with this, was on the issue where we get towards good and evil and that conversation. You said and I may be a couple words out here, but you said, if we don't meet God's standards, he lets the suffering continue. And that one was a mind blower, and perhaps you want to start there. I'll say that's the end of my time.
All right. Thank you, Luke. And just a second here. So, Jojo, you have your...
Yeah, can I sync my time then, so we can have 10 minutes?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, and go. Well, thanks, Luke. I appreciate your comments in terms of our early rebuttal here. But let me start with that suffering comment. I think one of the key issues that we're talking about is, why do bad things happen to all of us? And my only point is that sometimes bad things happen to us because we do bad things. Right? When we look at the history of famine, for example, in certain continents like in Africa, much of the suffering that happens there is because of war, because people are greedy, because colonized countries are still being abused by their colonizers. Right? So when we talk about suffering, we have to make sure we rightly blame the person who actually causes it. It isn't just a matter of God's letting that happen. But I think in terms of what I want to be able to address from a Christian perspective is that we as Christians believe that God gives us moral standards in the first place so that we can avoid suffering. Because he knows that things that we consider sin from a Christian perspective are by definition things that are going to harm us in the long run. That's why God makes them wrong for us to do in the first place. So I'm not sure exactly how that should blow you away in terms of conclusion. This has been a Christian teaching for 2,000 years or so. But the idea that there are consequences to bad behavior is something every parent teaches a child. It shouldn't be a surprise. Now, in terms of what you've said, let me go through a bit of this, and then I want to address a few things as well. I'm not suggesting how you're a bad person, and I appreciate the fact that there's a distinction between an anti-theist and an anti-theist. I guess, ists. But again, the idea that you would recoil at the fact of me calling you an anti-theist suggests to me that there's a moral standard there that we're living by, that we shouldn't be against people, right? And where does this concept come from? Where did this get the concept of the idea that we ought to dialogue and not just be against another group of people? Right? And I think this is really an important distinction between what I'm saying and what you're arguing for, because clearly we agree. And we agree that there are good things that we should do when we dialogue, when we talk to others, but that requires an objective moral standard that we have to live by. In fact, that I want to clarify, you said that we can't be moral in an amoral universe. That's not what I said. I said moral standards are meaningless in an amoral universe. Remember, again, as a Christian, I believe that God has written in our hearts a moral standard. So that is true for every person, regardless of whether or not they believe in God or not. And I appreciate the fact that a lot of people in our culture nowadays don't believe in God, but that doesn't preclude the fact that they can't act morally. The question is, does that moral standard they live by have any kind of grounding or meaning at all? When they say we ought to, for example, dialogue well, or we ought to fight blasphemy laws, what standard can they use other than their personal preference, which is what you just said in your opening statements? All we have if there's no objective moral standards. So when we think about what these moral standards are, again, you've suggested the consciousness of the moral. The morality is the well-being of conscious creatures. Sam Harris kind of argument. And by the way, again, from a Christian perspective, we believe that we ought to treat animals just with respect because they're also made by God. We can't just abuse nature. So there's no distinction, or there's no way to say that just because you believe that there's a human-centered form of morality, that the human-centered form of morality can't also extend morality or protection to non-human entities that live on Earth. That I think there's an obvious example there with the Christian teaching. Now, in terms of the God being subjective, I think it goes back to our definitions of God. Right? When we talk about defining what God is, if God is the source of all reality, which is what the Judeo-Christian Muslim God is, then that means clearly he's also the source of how we ought to behave. And if you know the arguments for fine-tuning, I know you're familiar with that. If not, the audience can check that out. But that the arguments for fine-tuning is that all of the universe actually was designed so that humans could flourish here on Earth. And I realize that there are a lot of hostile things on Earth, but gosh, the growing population rate, we're up to 8 billion people now in the universe, and our lifespan is growing. People's standards of living are growing. The fact that there are children being born today, I think, speaks against what you're saying, Luke, because people still have hope that the universe that they're having their children born into actually is a universe that those children can enjoy and treasure and enjoy the company of other people. And their votes, I think, matter in this situation because there are more and more people growing on this earth, not less and less. So let me just go through in terms of my objections, in terms of my rebuttal. First, I want to speak onto the idea of morality. Luke, you're trying to suggest that objective morality doesn't exist. Well, there's 3 problems with that. First, if there is no moral guide, there is no objective morality, there is no moral guidance for how people ought to behave. There is no such thing as common ground. So when you, for example, want religion to be removed from the schools so they're all public, you're arguing that that's a good way to remain neutral. But of course, that view isn't neutral. But more than that, if there's no objective morality, there is no such thing as common good. There's no reason for you to impose your personal preference on people like myself who disagree with you about the role of religion in education. In fact, becoming a secular rights activist, the word right has no meaning in an amoral universe that's actually impactful. There's no way to say that you have a right to do this regardless of culture and time and space, because if morality is merely our preference, then those rights will change when culture and time and space change. Secondly, there's no evil to speak out against. If there are no objective moral standards, there's no such thing as objective evil. So things like blasphemy laws in Muslim countries, or religious people trying to impose their views by making sure that people in Africa, for example, don't wear condoms, that's not evil. And we have no right to complain about it because that's just their personal preference. We have no objective standard to say that they shouldn't be doing that other than what we prefer from our culture and vantage point. And how can we not say that's a form of colonization once more, colonialism once more, when there are no objective standards to say that ought to not be the case? And thirdly, if there are no objective morals, then there's no reason for atheists to complain about others. Think about it. If you're against delusions, great. But if my delusion helps me and my tribe survive, whether that's religion or anything else, then what right do you have to tell me that I ought to change? If I ought to change so that I can make sure that atheists survive more, that's not a compelling reason for me to change my mind. If I ought to change because it's better for me to have a worldview that accepts other people or that's not delusional, then that requires an objective moral standard for you to say that I ought to change. And I think this is really the key here. There's a difference between what we're saying and what we're actually doing in everyday life. And what we can just do, anyone who's watching this can just go to, according to Luke's Facebook page, and almost every article there are moral outrages against what Christians are doing. For example, on October 26th, he writes that it's wrong for Catholics to impose their morals on other people. It's wrong for October 24th for Muslim countries to have blasphemy laws, as I mentioned before. He is upset that money is going to Catholic education from the public purse. Why? That's just your personal preference. By the way, the law guarantees that that's the case. And so if the law says it's right and there are no objective morals, why are we complaining about it? On October 18th, he says there is a moral overreach, even by Catholic standards. But what is a moral overreach if there's no objective morality? It's just them imposing their morals, their perspective, their preferences on someone else. That's no different than saying, that's just your opinion. That is their opinion, and you have no right in this amoral universe to tell them that they're wrong. In fact, it wouldn't be wrong to say that you're morally superior, which is something else that you said on that day. And I could go on. The October 12th, this is the one I actually think is great that he posted. Talks about how it's wrong for Muslims to slash little girls to prepare them for an Islamic ceremony. Well, I think that's objectively wrong as well. But the problem is he can't say that in an amoral universe. You can't argue that. But your own Facebook page, your own Twitter account, all the moral outrages that you speak about aren't actually outrageous if there's no objective morality. So clearly, if there is objective morality, and this is the argument I've given before, it cannot just come from Luke or myself or my perceptions of reality. It has to come from someone who has the right to make those moral laws and the power to enforce them, and they cannot be limited by time and space.
You're done? Yes.
I am.
All right, thank you. All right, now we will go to the cross-examination part here, and that is Luke can cross-examine Jojo, and you have 6 minutes. So basically, Luke, it's your time. If you have questions for anything that Jojo has basically stated, please, this is your time to ask them. So basically, this is the back and forth part.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I'm not entirely sure whether I have questions or whether I have make statements and allow and Jojo can address them. The first thing I would say is, in terms of religion in the public sphere, secularism is neutral. That is the opinion of the Supreme Court of Canada. He mischaracterizes me when he says that I'm trying to take religion out of schools. Completely, that isn't the case either. There is context to that. Further on the matter of Catholic education, the issue is just about whether it is reasonable or appropriate in this day and age, culturally. And I'm not entirely sure about the outrage. The outrage is usually more reserved for the Catholic hospitals that are publicly funded that don't let non-Catholics that ended up in hospital through no fault of their own have their Canadian charter rights. I don't know whether you'd like to comment on any of those things, Jojo?
Well, I guess I would ask you, Luke, it's your turn to ask me questions. So my response would be, if the debate is whether or not kids should be allowed to pray in public school, when you say that they should remove prayer from school, that isn't a neutral position. That's your position.
Okay.
And if you want to remove prayer from school, you're imposing a moral position on those of us who want prayer in school.
Okay, so here's the problem right now. What you've done is you've taken excerpts from my Facebook page. You don't understand the context, and because of that, you're misrepresenting them.
Well, correct me, Luke. What is your position about that?
Well, the position is that in public schools, we only do one Christian prayer. That the Constitution only protects the Christian prayer, and that you can't do prayers for other religions in public school. But you just said, in terms of, you're referring to charter rights, and one of those charter rights is for Catholic and Protestant schools, and Catholics and Protestants to have schools that are funded, that are guaranteed in these provinces, including Alberta. So if these are actually charter rights, that we have a right to religious kind of education in this province, why would you say that's wrong for us to have prayer in school? Well, firstly, there are two separate issues, so let's deal with the prayer issue. I think it is a reasonable position to say that in a multicultural society, in a publicly funded school, that we only that the school should not lead or favor non-religion or religion, or one religion over all other religions, and that's what. And I get that,
but I guess the question I'm asking is, I'm sorry, Luke. I just wanted to throw in this though. But the point I'm trying to make is that view that you just espoused there isn't neutral. That's the point. It's reasonable. I'm not even disagreeing. How can that be neutral? You just said it's a view in terms of a multicultural society. Well, there's also a view that says, gosh, we have a Christian heritage, and it's guaranteed in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that Protestant and Catholic prayers in schools should be allowed. No other religion is mentioned. Whether that's right or wrong, that's still the law. And so it can also be reasonably argued that we ought to favor Christianity. Regardless, the point is neither of our positions are neutral, Luke. That's the only point I'm making. So secularism is not neutral.
But let Luke talk, Jojo.
Secularism is neutral. And the Supreme Court of Canada has ruled that, well, then you need to look at the Sanguinet ruling from last year on prayer by city councils. because the
So
Supreme
then, can I
Court
ask you why?
was absolutely clear on this.
Okay, let Luke clarify his position.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
In
Go ahead,
fact,
Luke.
the Supreme
Okay, I'm sorry.
actually went on to say absolutely specifically that the absence of prayer or the absence of religion was not, did not presuppose that it was anti-religion in any way. And the other thing, just on the subject of Catholic education, just so you know, the deal for them to have this right was kind of dependent on a bunch of details and caveats. And if those details and caveats aren't being met, then the deal doesn't stand. And the argument that I would make is that legally, the deal doesn't stand. More than happy to have that conversation on another day too.
Still doesn't sound like it's neutral to me. It sounds like your point of view.
Well, see, now here's the other thing. What is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? It is a set of values and, well, I'm only aware of a couple, and I don't think it really matters which one. The point is that whether we are a local community, or whether we're a country, or whether we're a group of countries, people come together and agree behaviors. That's what we do. We agree them. And you don't get to say, hey, just because lots of us agree that is now an objective reality, morality. It isn't. If a lot of us agree with something, it can just be that a lot of us agree on a subjective morality.
Well, again, going back to subjective, it's about preferences, right? If you're asking this question, then my challenge to that is, how do we determine what minority rights are? If it's just a matter of a whole bunch of people agreeing, and there's a whole bunch of people who disagree. So, for example, right now, the majority of people in Canada believe in some sort of deity. The minority right now is atheists. Now, obviously, that just because atheists are a minority, I think it's objectively fair to say that we ought to treat atheists with respect, despite the fact that they're a minority, right? But that's the problem. Where do we get this idea from that even if you're a minority, the majority still has to respect you and respect certain things like your right to life, your right to organization, right? If it's just a matter of agreement, then as soon as a group of people disagree with this consensus, it's no longer morality. It's just whatever personal preferences are.
But this is a set of understandings that have literally evolved as being the best way for us as human beings to flourish.
To which human beings?
And, well, you make a good point. Certainly the more secular countries, the ones that have less religion, have flourished more.
So then, in terms of us being religious, should we try to stop the atheists now before their flourishing puts us in extinction?
Well, funnily enough, I actually support anybody in believing whatever they want, which was something that you kind of mischaracterized earlier as well. I think that we just make arguments for positions, and that people can make up their own minds.
And I agree with that, Luke. I think that's great. We both agree with that. That's why we're on this debate. And I admire all your great work. Like, I agree with you when you fight blasphemy laws in Islamic countries. I think that's a wonderful thing. The problem
I fight blasphemy laws in Canada.
Great. I agree with that too. But here's the point. Though, those kinds of things that you're doing, if they're just merely preferences, have no impetus on changing anybody else's minds. That's the whole point. In terms of human flourishing, Muslim countries can argue, gosh, we're flourishing right now. The largest growing religion in the world is Islam. They have lots and lots of children. Why ought we to change our minds on any of these human rights issues if they're helping us flourish right now to throw away those human rights?
Well, I think that's because I think you want it both ways. You want to have objective morality be a good thing, but at the same time, there's an awful lot of objective morality that is used to either create or protect an awful lot of bad things that occur. And blasphemy, ironically, is one of them. That it's quite easy for someone apparently to claim that, you know, God doesn't want to be offended in some way, shape, or form. Now we have this objective belief that criticizing that particular deity is now worthy of punishment. And
but look, what do you mean by bad? Luke, what do you mean by bad? Why is that a bad thing? What does that word bad mean?
Well, because getting your head cut off is usually bad.
But why is that bad? Not in Islamic culture. In their worldview, in their perspective, from their preference point, that's a morally good thing.
Yeah.
So why would that be? Why would you say that's bad if they have a right to believe as they wish in terms of their morality?
Because we, as human beings, have an ongoing shared experience. And the behaviors that we choose and the rules that we choose impact the conscious experience of not just all living humans, but an awful lot of conscious creatures as well. And that's just a shared existence. And it makes absolute evolutionary sense for all those people in that closed system to find a way that maximizes the conscious experience of every individual in that closed system.
Right, and that's what the Muslim would argue from those countries, that we are prospering because we throw gay people off buildings. We're prospering because we're living out the Islamic way of life, and that's an immoral standard that we want to live by. And by the way, that goes to my point about H.G. Wells. If we were to evolve into two human races where one eats the other, what moral standard would we use then? Because if we can evolve morality like we have now, we can also evolve out of it. That's something that, as talking about objective morality, there is no such thing as objective standards, which means there could be a future where we evolve to a point where genocide is perfectly fine, or things like killing gay people is perfectly fine, right? Or killing atheists is perfectly fine, or maybe not killing, maybe torturing atheists for fun. That would be something that we could evolve to sometime in the future. Or vice versa. If Christianity disappears, then maybe it would be torturing Christians for fun, right? If we evolve into that kind of system, what would you say then about those actions? Would they be wrong?
I think that we can. Yes, I would say that they were wrong. I'm not scared of saying that that there are rights and wrongs. And that
but
these
that's
rights
morality.
and wrongs. But that's not objective morality.
Well, okay, so how can they be? So
it is,
in terms of
morality.
being in terms of being right and wrong, you've said they're right and wrong. So they're right and wrong for you, is what you're saying.
Well, not just are they right and wrong for me, but most people I know also think they're right and wrong.
Okay, so the people who are in your cultural milieu and your time period think they're right and wrong. But I'm talking about a different time period in the future where these kinds of things we evolve into. Would you think those people are perfectly legitimate in doing what they're doing, like throwing gay people off buildings or, torturing Christians for fun? If the human race evolved to a point where religion disappears and the few religious people who are left are tortured for the pleasure of everybody else, because of biology, our Darwinian evolution, then there would be no reason to say that what they're doing is wrong, correct?
Well, yes, there is. You see, and now the fact that you're using the future is completely irrelevant to, it could be the future, it could be the past. It could just be in another country right now. The point
absolutely.
Is, the point is that there are positions that can be reasonably argued that doing this is better than doing that for the experience of conscious human beings or conscious creatures. That's it.
In terms of
the fact that you were saying that might. That some people might change. doesn't change that right now. That's it.
Well, I'm not sure how that answers my point, because you're still using moral words like better or reasonable argument. You're assuming
you don't own those, Jojo. That's the thing. You seem to think that you own those with by declaring objectivity.
But is it wrong for me to own those? I think the point is what I'm saying, Luke, is not that I own those. What I'm saying is you're still borrowing from a moral framework when you say we ought to reason together. You're still borrowing from a moral framework when you say things get better or worse. Those moral standards.
I don't disagree with that. But how do you?
But those moral standards don't. But those moral standards can't exist if there's no objective morality. Whose morality are you whose scale are you using to determine what's right and wrong? Yours. Well, that gives no impetus to me.
The scale of the people around me in terms of what is better or worse conscious experiences.
And that's what Islamic countries and North Korea argue as well. That's the point.
Yes. And
Kevin, I think we're past cross-examination time, right?
Yes, I know. We're going. I understand. Yes, I know. But you guys are talking, so we're continue. We've got another 15 minutes or so.
Go on. I imagine Jojo's got some good ones for me. So let's get into that.
Yeah.
Well, I have some. Well, okay. Luke, if I could start then. In your worldview, what is the origin of religion, particularly the belief in God?
What is the origin of it? Well, my opinion, and clearly this is just my best guess, is that it originated as a way to explain things.
Okay.
Can you?
So keep going.
Expand on that.
Can you just maybe a little bit?
Sure. As Bill likes to say, sun goes up, sun goes down, tide goes in, tide goes out. Can't explain that. So I think there was a time when humans wanted both meaning, and they wanted to give the concept of security and predict a predictable future. And so I think in a lot of cultures these stories grew to explain the things that they couldn't answer, and for sure probably or possibly to give meaning to existence.
Is that why you think religion has been so successful as part of human history, in terms of every culture, every society has had some sort of spiritual or supernatural beliefs? Well,
I don't know why it's been successful. There is an evolutionary argument. I'm sure you've seen. I think Shermer makes it quite well. The argument of agency. Where when the bush moves in the breeze, you're an awful lot more likely to survive if you think there is agency. You think it's an animal, and so you run every time, even though 99 times out of 100 it's the wind. Now, the one time it is an animal, you survive.
Right. So there is some evolutionary benefit. There's some evolutionary benefit, or at least function, for religion that it serves.
Yeah, and I will just say, listen, I can't argue evolution, and then ignore the flourishing of religion and superstition over time.
Right. So then the question then I think is flows from all of these points. If religion serves some evolutionary function that has helped human flourishing throughout history, why do you as an atheist insist on having to change our religious beliefs? For those of us who are religious, who still believe that it causes human flourishing, why do you create an organization like the Edmonton Atheist Association that insists that people should think like you?
Well, first first of all, that would be such a horrific mischaracterization of what the Society of Edmonton Atheists do, or what its mission statement is. It couldn't be any further than an organization that proselytizes or that goes out of its way to convert people or tell them what they should think.
Then please clarify, what is it that you guys do?
The mission statement, I believe, is something along the lines of we foster a community for atheists, agnostics, freethinkers, and skeptics to come together. You have to remember that even today, but certainly an awful lot over the years, atheists have been in the closet along with the gays, and for an awful large part for the same reason. A 2012 joint study between the UBC and a US university found that North American Christians trusted atheists at the same level that they trust rapists. And we are consistently at the bottom of the pile, although the Muslims are giving us a run for our money these days with the Christians, from the Christian viewpoint, in terms of morality.
And Luke, by the way, I think you're a great guy. I hope you understand that. I'm not trying to say otherwise.
No, listen,
your Alberta Secular Conference has the tagline, sharing ideas with a vision for a more secular and inclusive Alberta. That sounds pretty evangelistic to me, if you're trying to create a vision for a more secular and inclusive Alberta, right?
Well, firstly, it's not my conference, although I do speak at it. Or have done.
Okay, so it's the founding sponsors is the Society of Edmonton Atheists. Isn't that your organization?
Yeah, he's a director.
It's not my organization. I am one of a number of directors. There is a vice president and a president above me.
And I'm just saying, in terms of characterizing the organization, you said I was wrong in characterizing the organization as evangelistic. I'm just giving counter evidence based on your own conference that the organization had just a few months ago.
Hang on, those are two different organizations. You're conflating the two. And in terms of it being more secular,
the Society of Edmonton,
where it has been active, yes, it has been. Where has it been active in being more secular? On the issue of religion in education, in the issue of rights being, and again, rights driven, by the way. The
transgender
would,
I understand.
Well, no, the fact that an 8-year-old atheist kid has to get up in front of their class and go stand out in the corridor on their own because the majority have decided that they all want to say a prayer. And this is the privilege, and again, the word is privilege.
Back to my question. Again, I'm just referring to it as a reference. Back to my question. If religion provides some sort of human flourishing for those of us who are religious, it has provided some evolutionary advantage for us. Why is it that organizations, even if it's not your organization, perhaps let's speak of other atheists then, want or think that the world would be a better place if we'd be more secular and inclusive? I'll use that phrase from the Secular Conference.
I think that there are other spaces as well, including the Catholic hospital assisted dying issue. Mm-hmm. Okay, and again, compounded by the public funding aspect.
But those are all moral standards, by the way.
Sure. In which case, everything is, and that's okay, but it doesn't make it objective, and it doesn't make it source.
But the problem, and the question I'm alluding to, because this is my Q&A time, and I'm not trying to be rude, but it is my cross-examination, so I'm allowed to interrupt. But the point is, you're right, it doesn't make it objectively wrong. The question is, we can't complain about other people's moral standards if there is no objective moral wrong. We can't insist that other people ought to change. What? How? Is it? It's like saying your preference is something I don't like.
That is what complaining is. You ought to change. That is the complaint. You ought to change.
I never do that with preferences. But look, do you really? Is that something that you see as a necessary to do if we're talking about personal preferences? If someone likes one flavor of jelly bean versus another, or someone likes a different color than another, because you alluded to the purple analogy earlier. I have no qualms. There's no moral impetus. There's no bad feelings if you like purple and I don't. But I do have this idea that you're doing something wrong if you're trying to kill an atheist because they're committing blasphemy laws versus respecting and disagreeing respectfully, like we are now, with someone who doesn't have the same religious values as you. I think most people recognize, and we're talking about this quite clearly here, your website talks about that quite clearly, that there are objective standards here that we know are different from just personal preferences, where we are just saying live and let live. And Christians are also have that same standard too. There are a lot of things we just say live and let live. But things like killing atheists just because they have to blaspheme God, we would disagree with that as well because it's objectively wrong. And that goes back to my question here, is if there is human flourishing, if I could show you from a Christian perspective why human flourishing happens from a religious perspective, then based on your own worldview that morality is something that evolved, why do you even want to change our minds on that?
Well, the answer to that question is, if you actually track the flourishing of people over more recent history, the flourishing is taking place in more secular countries. So,
right,
sure,
all the secular countries
I accept the argument.
Just let him finish, though, Jojo, please.
Well, okay.
Sorry, I'm sorry. You're right. Go ahead.
So first of all, these values that you talk of existed, they predate Christianity. So, this whole argument that the golden rule is, the place by which we measure everything, do everything, lots of evidence that there were versions of the golden rule before Christianity ever existed, and even more evidence that morality existed inherent in older humans as well as other animals. But of course, immorality exists as well. So I mean, I don't see. I'm unconvinced by your position that you seem to keep claiming everything as being an objective morality, when the fact that that we've evolved into a subjective morality works just fine. And over the last 150 years, I think I can argue very, very strongly that a secular, non-religious based viewpoint is better for human flourishing.
Again, there's no need to argue if there's no objective standard to argue for. But Kevin, do you want to get to the conclusion remarks?
Go ahead, Luke.
No, that wasn't me.
Oh, okay. Thought that sounded like you. Sorry. I actually, if you don't mind, before we get to conclusion, I'd like to ask a couple of questions, if you don't mind, because this was going to be the online interactive part, but I'm gonna, I'll take this for my time here. There are, and I'm going to ask this to both of you. There are some people that would say that the atheist community, without the value of a scripture or something like that is apparently to guide them, like the Christians have shown more moral courage than Christians have. I'd like for you guys to respond to that, and in addition to underlining that, what do you do with a book that some have said has some interesting moral dilemmas in it that you are using as a moral standard, i.e. the Bible?
That's a double-barreled question there. That's two different points altogether. But
yeah, absolutely, and I recognize that. So let's start with the first one too. How would you respond to the fact that there have been times that atheists have shown there's a perception that the atheist community has shown a more higher level of morality than the Christian community has? Well, again, from a Christian perspective, that's not problematic at all. That in terms of our consistency of our worldview, it might be problematic in terms of our consistency of our behavior for sure. But as I already mentioned, the Christian worldview says that God wrote morality in our hearts, and therefore it's very plausible that there are a lot of very morally good atheists. Absolutely. I don't see why that would be any kind of a suggestion. Again, the question is how do these atheists know they're being morally good? And to be fair, often the argument from atheists is that all these secular countries in Europe, they're all prospering and they're wonderful, and it's obvious that the more secular you are, the more prosperous you are. But that's simply not the story of history. All of these countries have Christian backgrounds in Europe. All of these countries still have religious influence, even if they're waning, if they're dying. For example, Sweden has a state church. The Netherlands still has people, I think, paying to churches. So you have some of your taxes actually go to state churches that are recognized. And even if people don't recognize or call themselves Christians any longer, clearly the vestiges of Christianity and its Christian morals are still in place, even if people don't call themselves Christians anymore. If you're going to talk about secular countries and secular nations being prosperous, well, we need to talk about our secular countries like North Korea, like Vietnam, and ask then, are their secular values the ones we want to emulate?
All right. Firstly, in terms of the European secular countries, there is the leftover of lots of religious and lots of religious privilege because of it. Still, peers in the House of Lords in the UK, or like you say, there is still technically a government church in Sweden, and they tax, they tithe. I think it's you actually have to opt out. You're automatically opting in to tithing. Yet it isn't about what the country's doing, is it? It's about what the people are doing. 60% of British people are not religious, and it's the same with Sweden and Finland and Denmark. Incredibly high percentages. Yet, ironically, when we get into this idea of North Korea or the Soviet Union or China, whilst the Soviet Union or Russia today or China has government restrictions over you can't be in the Chinese government and be religious, and it only allows 15 different religions, hence the issue with like Falun Gong. The vast majority of people in those countries are religious, and in Russia, not only are the vast majority of people are religious, they are Christian. So that's the as far as secularism and religion is concerned, where secularism has flourished is when religion has been kept out of public policy and the public sphere, not forced on one another. And if you want to look at Christianity unfettered, then sure, go to Uganda. Go to Bolivia. What about all these other countries? That's unfettered Christianity right there. You want to have a big armful of the morals that you'll get there in the treatment of girls and women and each other and people of different faiths. But miraculously, we're ignoring those Christian countries where those, I would suggest to you that in the West, those secular countries actually aren't better because they're secular, but the religion is better because secularism knocked the rough corners off of the objective morality of, being gay is wrong or wearing condoms is objectively morally wrong.
I think again, back to the debate, because I think this is where the question lies. You're saying that it's wrong for people to say that wearing condoms is wrong. Is that right?
No, the Catholic Church, so the largest religious group,
yes,
on the planet,
yes,
has an edict, a dogma,
right.
And and the emissaries, the representatives of God via the Catholic Church.
That's not my question.
Wait.
My question is, are they wrong for doing that?
Well, but here's why they're wrong for doing it. Because they're saying it is an objective morality that preventing insemination take place. It is an objective morality.
Okay, so is that objectively wrong that they're doing that?
Well, it depends how you feel about HIV and disease and human suffering, doesn't it?
I'm asking you.
I think
is that
it's
objectively wrong for them?
I think it's a bad thing, Jojo.
Okay, so but bad is another word for wrong, so that's just a tautology. I'm asking, is what they're doing something that is wrong now, wrong tomorrow, wrong yesterday?
We're dancing around the same issue. Okay, I think what the argument comes down to, for me, is that you can evolutionarily, if that's even a word, or we have evolutionarily got to a point where we are understanding that the flourishing of everybody means selfishly the flourishing of myself and my gene pool.
Right.
And you're suggesting that that reality is objective and eternal and comes from a different source. But that's not
what I said. I never agreed with you that the moral standard is human flourishing. Right. I never said that. And so you can't put words in my mouth either. Because I actually explicitly disagreed with Sam Harris on that, because I don't think it's just about human flourishing, though human flourishing is definitely part of it, because it goes to the heart of what evolution does. If evolution is merely about human flourishing, then first of all, that makes no sense, because evolution is merely about survival. It's not about favoring any kind of species over the other. But secondly, that also means we can evolve out of any moral standard that we have now. So if it's about selfish genes, like you said, then there's no reason for me to want your selfish genes to survive if it affects and takes away from my tribe surviving. So, yeah, you know what? You can look at Uganda, you can look at Bolivia, and Christianity's only been there for about several hundred years. We're talking about the Netherlands, where they had Christianity 500 years ago, the Reformation, and Catholicism prior to that. So, again, you're not comparing apples to apples here. It's unfair to look at Ugandan practices and say, gosh, that's Christianity, when Christianity only became a popular and very forceful religion over the last couple of hundred years. But the whole point is...
Let's use the Middle East as an example then.
And I would agree with you, because I think they're doing objectively wrong things. Because it's not about my religion. It's not about my culture. It's about the fact that there's a moral standard that exists beyond us. There has to be something that exists beyond culture. And this is the point. When you disagree with Catholics and what their position is on birth control, and you're saying that they ought not to do that, and then you characterize that as not objectively moral, then you have no moral persuasion, you have no impetus, the Catholic has no impetus to listen to your preference. That's why objective morality exists, because you act as if they ought to.
Okay, I don't think I have anything to add to that. I think that subjective reality is demonstrating itself to be the best for humanity that we've seen in the history of humanity. So.
Okay. Do you go ahead?
Do you have any other questions, Kevin?
Let's just talk about quickly here, and we'll kind of do this in 5 minutes, and then we'll do a little bit of a wrap up here, as we have gone over time, and I do apologize for that. My second question, and I'm just using this as common questions, but one of the things that does get into play here is the Bible, specifically the Old Testament. And there are people that are very uncomfortable with some of the actions and Luke mentioned this in his opening remarks about the Old Testament, the idea of the Old Testament God, and that the things that happen in in the section of the Old Testament of the Bible. How do you wrap that around this concept of an objective morality then, if it comes from a God?
I guess you're asking me that question, Kevin, right?
I'd like for both of you to respond if you can.
I can answer this one real fast for myself. Because I don't believe that the Old Testament is informed in any way, shape, or form, I don't think it does address, any God or creator that may or may not exist. So there is no issue with me. My only issue is that people think that it's informed.
Okay, but so my question then for you, Luke, then would be the next part of that is, what do you do with Jesus? Do you David Simpson said that he believes that he's existed, but he certainly wasn't a Messiah. So he believed that Jesus had some very good moral teachings for us, not necessarily a Messiah. What are your thoughts on the teachings of Jesus then in the New Testament?
All right. Before I answer that, Jojo, was there anything that you wanted to say to address the prior position on the Old Testament?
Oh, I was going to let you finish your thoughts, Luke. It's up to you.
Okay.
I mean, I can.
So, listen, as far as I'm concerned, I think Jesus, the guy, probably existed. I think it's far more likely that he existed than didn't exist. Clearly, I don't think that he is either the son of a deity or a part of a deity. He was clearly a man who garnered some attention in the day. Now, the issue is, of course, when we talk about the teachings of Jesus, how do we know what teachings were? If we grant that he lived, how do we know what is written down is what he said? Clearly, there are a lot of issues with that. The second thing is, we're still cherry picking because, Jesus is attributed to say some pretty rough things along with the good stuff. Now, I have for years actually been a proponent of atheist or agnostic Christianity because my issue has always been the surety that the problem of knowing what God wants, as opposed to if you take Jesus, like a Gandhi or like any other, either real or fictional historical place for getting wisdom or centering yourself, then have at it. And I listened to your podcast with the atheist Christian the other day. I thought, brilliant, good for him. Go for all the good stuff. Let's be honest about the cherry picking, and let's get rid of all the dangerous, superstitious woo-woo.
All right, Jojo, your time.
I'm not here to defend the Bible today because we're talking about objective morals, and what I've said, it could be true if I was speaking as a Muslim or a Jew, even a liberal Christian. All of those things would be true regardless. So I just want to make that caveat because when it comes to this kind of question, it's a whole set of different issues, right? But, one of my favorite passages from the Old Testament is actually about the story of Jonah. And some of you know, obviously, Jonah was sent by God to the city of Nineveh, this great city that was very sinful. And this prophet of God didn't want to go and basically preach to these people a message of repentance, that God would punish them if they didn't repent. And so he goes the other way, gets swallowed by a fish. That's the story, of course, and God brings him to Nineveh anyway. And he preaches, and he gets the people to repent. They all come back. God spares the city because of their repentance, but Jonah resents what happens. And he's really mad because the people of Nineveh are actually quite big enemies of the Jews, of the Israelites, and they do not want them to be spared. They want them to be destroyed. And in the last chapter of Jonah, God actually tells Jonah this: "You had compassion on the plant for which you did not work, and which you did not cause to grow, which came up overnight and perished overnight. Should I not have compassion on Nineveh, the great city in which there are more than 120,000 persons who do not know the difference between their right hand and left hand," which most people allude to as children because they don't know the difference between right and left, "as well as many animals." And I love that passage because it explicitly says here that God cares for children who were not Jewish, not Israelites, but the enemies of the Israelites. And God also cares for the animals that he made in that city. And he did not want to destroy them. You see, a lot of the people who attack the Old Testament do so not really understanding what the Old Testament's all about, which is that God gave people a chance to repent and come to him. And you may not agree with the message, that's fine. But if you're going to criticize the Bible, at least understand that. Because from a Christian perspective, from a Judeo-Christian perspective, and Luke's right, these moral laws exist prior to Christianity. That's why we also believe that the Jewish Bible is also something we believe in. And it actually is a great point for me when it comes to objective morality, that objective morals exist beyond time and space, even before Christianity started. But in terms of this, it shows something specific, that we as Christians believe there's something worse than human suffering here on earth, that God wants to spare us from being able to face evil. And I think that's, and again, any parent will know that. You know, I have a friend who took his child to get a shot, a needle, and his child was suffering immensely because of all the pain to fight a disease that he was trying to fight. And this child didn't know why his parent was willing to get him to suffer. But that suffering was necessary for him to be cured of his disease. And I think God works the same kind of way. So if we want to judge God and say the Bible is a terrible thing, it's contradictory, you can't trust it, there's all of these contradictions, we don't even know if Jesus exists, all of that is a moral judgment against Christianity and Christian teachings. And whether or not you agree with Christianity, that's fine. But you cannot commit that kind of moral judgment if objective morals don't exist.
All right. We will leave it there. Thank you guys very much for coming on.
I thought we were having a closing statement.
Please go ahead. Yeah, go ahead with your closing statements.
Were you holding a closing statement back, Jojo?
I do. I have mine right in front of me. So
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, good stuff. I just want to make sure that I'm not taking an unfair advantage, but we seem to have shimmied around what's going on here.
Yeah, we have. Exactly. Yes, we have. But that was because of the lack of live online. I made a decision as we went through to kind of go with a little bit more back and forth between you guys. So Jojo, go. Since Luke started with the opening statement, I'll let you go ahead with your closing. Start with the closing statement.
All right, let me just time myself. Kevin, my clock just turned off here for a sec. Give me just 2 seconds. Okay, can you synchronize? Are you ready?
Ready, go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, again, I just want to thank Luke and Kevin for being part of this discussion and inviting me to be part of it. I'm really honored to be considered, as our ministry and our work is about talking about these issues and making sure that Canadians have thoughtful responses, and that people who are outside the Christian faith can know that there are actually thoughtful responses from the Christian worldview. Now, this debate is obviously not about objective morality exists without God, because we actually agree on that, Luke and I. What the debate has become is whether or not objective morality actually exists. And I think when it comes down to it, all of these points that Luke has made really hasn't addressed that issue. He's just insisted that it's subjective. But subjective things are not things that you infer or insist that other people ought to obey. Subjective things are not things that you have to tell, say, someone you disagree with from a religious perspective, or a country that you disagree with, that they have to change because your definition of human flourishing requires them to, especially when they have their own definition of what human flourishing looks like. And so ultimately, the only way to arbitrate between those two kinds of definitions is if there's an objective standard that exists beyond the culture and society, beyond our own personal preferences, that have to come from an external source, from someone who has the right to make those moral laws, and also the power to enforce them. In fact, the fact that Luke says that there are moral standards that have existed prior to Christianity, prior to the Bible, actually speaks to my point, that objective morals are not limited by humanity, human writings, human understandings of religion. All of those things are not limited or don't limit morality. They can describe it, but objective morals seem to be part of our design as the universe. In fact, let me just make 3 important points here, and I think his actions speak to these points, even if his words tonight don't. When he says that he's proclaiming that people who are theists are incorrect or wrong, in fact, even immoral in many of the actions that they do. And by the way, some of those actions I agree that are immoral. Luke's right, but he's expecting that people ought to think a certain way. And again, you can't insist that people ought to think a certain way if there's no objective morals. When he says that people should behave a certain way, and that's my second point, things like on education, like kids should not be left out when everybody else has decided to pray. Again, that's a behavior that he wants to change. That requires an objective moral standard that he has to reference so that other people can say it's not just my preference, not just something I like, it's something that's objectively good for everyone to agree with. That's an objective standard. And thirdly, when he works on projects like helping people, atheists in foreign countries, when he wants countries to change and respect certain rights, that means he wants people to live a certain way. And again, that also requires objective morals. To think, to behave, and to live a certain way is something that objective morality offers. In fact, remember what Rational Wiki says. Objective morality is the idea that a certain system of ethics or set of moral judgments is not just true according to a person's subjective opinion, but is factually true. And even if Luke disagrees with me here, his own actions act as if his subjective beliefs are ones he believes are factually true for everybody. And so his actions speak louder at this point than his words. And so if there is a moral law, as C.S. Lewis says, there has to be a moral lawgiver who is intelligent, who doesn't just make laws arbitrarily. I'm not sure why just because a being has no beginning in time and comes and has no starting point, that somehow it's arbitrary. That's not the point. The definition of God we're working with is that he is the source of all creation, he is the source of all humanity, and then therefore, just like with a doll maker has the right to determine how and what his dolls will do and say and how they ought to act, a designer would also be able in this situation to determine how we ought to act if this kind of God exists. This God also provides moral rules that span time and space because he's not limited by time and space. And when we talk about things like what the Bible teaches, for example, well, we have to look at what those actually are. We can't just ignore them. But I think that's actually a sign of God's moral goodness, that he actually describes for us how we ought to behave. He doesn't just leave us in limbo. And so if all of these things are true, that there is a moral lawgiver, that there are moral standards that we ought to live by, then I think the points that I'm making show that very well, that it's obvious that there are objective morals and that God is the source of them. As philosopher J.L. Mackie says, that moral properties are queer, quote unquote, given naturalism. If there are objective values, they make the existence of a God more probable than it would have been without them. Thus, we have a defensible argument from morality to the existence of God. You see, Luke started this debate thinking that I was going to backdoor him and try to make it a debate about God. That's not what it is. I think it's quite clear, though, that even if he rejects objective morality, and the question I would think about is, why is that? When you live as if objective morality exists, do you?
Hello?
Because clearly your behavior shows that you believe in objective morality.
Thank you.
That's it.
All right, Luke, closing statement?
Well, let me zip through a couple of things before I forget them. Firstly, of course, from my perspective, I don't live as if objective reality exists. I live as if subjective reality, morality exists. On the issue of morality existing prior to Christianity, it also completely suits the narrative of evolution that would have happened over time. And I do want to say thanks to Kevin. This was a really great opportunity, and I appreciate it. My biggest thanks, though, to Jojo. You absolutely do have an intelligence and an understanding of this subject matter. You speak on it tremendously well, and given the fact that you were dealing clearly with a newbie, you batted me around like a playful cat, rather than perhaps a more vicious tiger. And for that, I give you a sincere thank you. I appreciated the lesson and the opportunity. These are my closing notes that I anticipated giving prior to my starting. Isaac Asimov, the famous sci-fi writer, in his 3, later became 4 laws of robotics, understood the fatal flaw of conflict between imperative laws. He used them as the mainstay of a number of stories. The laws are: 1, a robot may not injure a human being or through an action allow a human being to come to harm. 2, a robot must obey the orders given by its human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. And 3, a robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first or second laws. And while these laws may seem arbitrary or objective, they are all subjective. Law 1 does not automatically beat Law 2 or 3, as beautifully demonstrated in the 1950 book I, Robot. Each law is subjectively influenced by probability and context. As such, the robot in the story finds itself in a crippling equilibrium of non-action, where the higher probability of events affecting lesser laws was balanced by the lower probability of higher-ranked laws. And we see the same problem when we balance morals that at first appear to have the potential to be objective morals. If the suffering of conscious creatures is bad, then causing it or doing nothing to end it could be considered objectively morally wrong. Murder is considered morally wrong, and for some that would also qualify as an objective moral. But what about the fallen soldier lying on the battlefield, mortally wounded, in an indescribable pain, suffering physically and emotionally beyond comprehension? Is it more moral for his friend to end his suffering, or to stand by and watch and do nothing? This is like the conflict of Asimov's laws. One can seem to be more important than another in isolation, like murder over suffering. But in a complex, interconnected circumstance like life on Earth, even the most apparently objective morals become subjective. Even the 10 Commandments are largely subjective. Thou shalt not kill, except when, bunch of caveats. Thou shalt not steal, except when, bunch of caveats. No graven images of likenesses, except when. Honor thy mother and thy father, except when. Thou shalt not bear false witness, except when. In summary, can you have an objective morality without God? If an Abrahamic God like Yahweh exists, he is by necessity subjective and immoral. Many religiously driven objective morals are subjectively immoral. An objective reality can only be claimed to exist in isolation, and it fails immediately when it falls in conflict with another. Therefore, the universe does not have objective morality with or without a God. I have a little saying I like to use. It is this: I have no problem with those that believe in a God, only those that claim to know what his favorite color is. Because it is the delusion or the claim to know the will of a creator of the universe that causes, or it is the mask, the unquestionable authority behind which so much suffering is caused and hides. Female and male genital mutilations, child brides and rapes, women as second-class humans, not wearing condoms in HIV-torn Africa, not using contraception in places of poverty, honor killings and rape, murders for apostasy and blasphemy, the suffering, both mental and physical, of 1 million gays and their families, and the others in the LGBTQ community, suffering from disease preventable through stem cell research, suffering through the denial of assisted dying, the severe beating of children, ongoing wars and conflicts. The list of human suffering directly caused by or indirectly perpetuated through protection of the concept of religious objective morality is a stain upon humanity. And that is why it's important that religious objective morality shouldn't just be argued to not exist. It should be forcefully rejected for the arrogant and harmful delusion that it is. I'll take my reality subjectively with knowledge, reason, and compassion. Thank you.
And thank you, both of you, very much for joining us on the debate. Really appreciate that, and thank you again for your patience. If people want to contact you guys, how will they do that? If they had any questions after listening to this debate.
We'd love to have questions sent our way. We're at faithbeyondbelief.ca. Faithbeyondbelief.ca. You can email us at info@faithbeyondbelief.ca.
Great. And Luke, how do we follow you?
Well, you can find me at according2Luke on Twitter, according2Luke on Facebook. But what I might suggest is if people have questions, let's keep them visible. Maybe post them on either your Facebook page or your according to your agree or disagree page as you choose, and Jojo and I and others can continue to pick at what is a very, very interesting subject.
Okay, absolutely.
Great point. Kevin, if you could just tag us on those as well, so we know that a question is for us, I'd appreciate that.
Right? Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I want to thank the people that participated in the video were Smitty Miller, Justine Gosling, Kyan Smith, Jen Courtney, Yan Kesani, Zane Buchanan, Leah Hammond, and Ken Preeb, and David Simpson as well. So thank you guys very much for participating in my little interviews. Thank you also to Jojo and Luke for taking the time to coming on and with their patience as we went through the technical issues with this. Thank you, everyone that took the time to participate and want to be part of this. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Sorry it wasn't specifically live, but we are going to get this up. This is up right away, and thank you very much if you've gotten this far for listening. You can follow me at KEVOLE. Add me as a friend on Facebook, Kevin Olenek. If you're listening to this podcast, this is on Spreaker.com /KEVOLE. And thank you guys again very much. And we will talk to you all very soon. Thank you.
Thank you as well, Kevin. Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thank you.